Thank you, Greg. May 1965. A letter arrived at the seminary. Heard you're the new minister in town. Would you like to do the baccalaureate service in June? So, Bob. A couple weeks later, pile of moving boxes in the parsonage, knock on the kitchen door. Remember how Bob used to lean in when he talked to you? Hey there, how you doing? I'm Bob Leister, principal at the high school. Thanks for doing the baccalaureate service. That was the beginning of a long and precious friendship. Canoe trips to Maine, Lake George, teaching the J-stroke, sledding down Bethel Mountain Road when it was dirt and closed in the winter. Lots of meals. Lou, remember how he would call you and say, bringing home somebody for supper, put another plate on the table. And the necktie. Before the days of computers and high tech, Bob had scraps of paper and paper clips. And he would, oh, I see somebody nodding, and he would put those on his necktie with all the reminders. Teachers meeting at 3, talk to that kid about behavior in study hall, check the heat in the GAR hall. Closing the school on Wednesday afternoons for outdoor activities, ski lessons at Killington, hiking in the woods. Remember the time that the weather turned really ugly and there was a hiking group and they panicked and they scattered to the wind. They didn't listen to the leader. Bob assigned them Ernest Shackleton's book, Endurance. Oh, you know what it is. It was a lesson in leadership. Follow the leader, stay with the group, think about others. That was so Bob. And the supersized, oversized slide rule, he loved teaching math. He loved history. He loved his students. And remember how he would lean in. Hi there, how you doing? Many of you know Bill and Linda Pollock. They're in Florida and they regret deeply that they could not be here. But they sent a letter. Dear Lou, Chris, Harry, Mary, Scott, and your families. A very special man who enriched the lives of so many who had the good fortune to know, respect, and love him has physically departed. This is sad for all of us, but what he left behind in memories, lessons, stories, shared experiences, pictures, I swear he owned Kodak Film Company, and a strong moral example for all of us will be here forever. Bob demonstrated unsurpassed leadership, lessons in and out of the classroom, and a genuine passion for the many interests he cultivated. His generosity and concern for others and loyal friendship set him apart from other folks that we would call friends. He was very clear where he stood on issues, stated his position with logic, facts, and clarity. It would be fun, as well as almost an impossible exercise, to try to develop all the lists of events, activities, interests, hobbies, talents, and skills he possessed. In addition to the number and variety of interests was the fact that he did them all so well and enthusiastically, and he shared his success and wisdom with others. Whenever we got together, Bob was prepared with 10 pictures of family and friends involved in various activities in which he was also involved. Bob was a builder of solid values, strong family connections, effective and safe schools, pertinent curriculum, respect for others, community involvement, as well as air raid shelters, log cabins, sailboats, gardens, snowshoes, tables, campfires for reflector baking on canoe trips, and a very newsy Christmas family letter. Although we went our separate ways, geographically speaking, we were never far apart. From the day he welcomed me to Rochester in April 1964, a candidate for the social studies teaching position, until our final goodbye this past October, we stayed in touch. We enjoyed 55 years of friendship, during which time Bob was unknowingly my mentor for administrative issues, and more importantly, for developing strong and practicing personal responsibility, for fairness, attention to details, and the importance of family. During those 55 years, we shared many laughs and joyous moments. There were occasions when sometimes something would strike Bob so funny, he was unable to control his laughter. Oh, you remember, I see. He would end up on the floor, writhing in continuous laughter until the episode passed, and then with tears rolling down his cheeks, he would stand up and regain his composure. A very large hole in my personal universe has developed with Bob's passing. He will surely be missed. It also saddens me that Linda and I will not be able to attend the service. Linda and I have included a poem which seems to capture our feelings and love for Bob. It's called I'm Standing Upon the Seashore. I'm standing upon the seashore, a ship at my side, spreads her white sails to the moving breeze and starts for the blue ocean. She is an object of beauty and strength. I stand and watch her until, at length, she hangs like a speck of white cloud just where the sea and sky come together to mingle with each other. Then someone at my side said, "There she goes." Gone where? Gone from my sight. That is all. She is just as large in mast, hull, and spar as when she left my side. And yes, she is just as able to bear her load of living freight to her destined port. Her diminished size is in me, not in her. And just at the moment when someone says, "There, she is gone," there are other eyes watching, her coming, and other voices ready to take up the glad shout. There she comes. There he comes. Thank you.
Good morning. Those of you who have good eyes can read. This says patchwork. Most of you know what that is. I may have a hard time here because Bob was so big in my life. For the last few days, I've been thinking of how to say this. I was told 5 minutes. That's a challenge. I'll do what I can. My name's Chris Bales. I live in Buxton, Maine. I drove up here this morning. I intended to be on time. I kept putting stuff in the truck that I think I'll take down to the hall afterwards. And I was about to drive off, and then I couldn't. And I went out and I ripped the cover off the back of the pickup, and I mounted the roof racks, and I went out and put up. I couldn't come to Bob without putting on an 18-foot Grumman canoe. And I was parked right down by the cafe. It took me a minute to get permission. So anyway, I wrote it up, and I'll try to remember. So over the last year, I stopped I made it to the ranch 3 times, spring, summer, and October 30th. I actually worked for Casella based in Rutland, Vermont, but Bob was the real reason I'd come to Vermont. My sales territory is Maine, but every now and then I'd find reasons to get over here. And so the last time I brought a boat in the back of the pickup. It was big, it was round, it was orange, had an outboard motor on it. It was a 1,097-pound pumpkin. Came from Damascotta, Maine, where they have a pumpkin festival. And Bob used to teach down there in Damascotta, Newcastle, for a number of years. They're customers of mine. Anyhow, Bob got up out of the chair and walked out of the deck, looked at it. I got a picture of him looking over at the pumpkin boat. Okay. My last time seeing Bob was down at the Burn Hospice Center. And thanks to Harry, I was brought up to date on the fairly rapid changes that happened over the last 2 weeks there, in his life. And so I headed in there. I actually stayed with Chris, went over to see Lucille, and then went down to see him. And he was asleep. There was just the 2 of us there. I sat there looking at him for a while. Finally, I touched his shoulder. He kind of startled, looked up at me. He said, "Few words." He was lecturing me. And so I'm going to attempt to follow Bob's advice and share with you in a few words some memories of Bob. And then I'll tell you at the end what I did say to him. So, many of you know him as Bullet Bob. That name, I think, came from students and others, and one of the ways I think of that name is he talked in almost like bullet points, and he also wrote letters that way. Boom, 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 usually on graph paper. And I went through a folder about this thick last night, the Leister file. Of course, I couldn't have time to read them all, but I was looking, and I found a few gems that I brought with me, I'll have later. Bullet points on those letters. So here's some bullet points from Bob. Canoes. Get an 18-footer. Longer's better. Has more flotation. Actually, less work because it doesn't sit as low in the water. Track's better. He says, I go to Marathon, New York, take the trailer, buy a trailer load, 8 at a time, get a better deal. That's the factory. He did that twice while I was here. And, paddles. Make sure you get a long one in the stern. And teach the J-stroke. You gotta get that canoe to run straight. You know, it would drive you nuts to watch them doing this. Okay? Wanigan boxes. Those are storage containers you build to fit crosswise the canoe. They fit just right at the gunnel level. You put your cooking kit in it, the food, they work good around the campsite, you lug them ashore. And the surface is a great place to make PB&J sandwiches when you raft it up in the middle of Lake George. Okay. Life jackets. We usually, for the school program, we had those basic, orange ones, around the neck, tie them off. He says, make sure you get the ones to tie off up top. He said, that'll keep your head afloat when you need it, when you're in the water. And have some extras. You always need to have an extra paddle. You need to have an extra, life jacket amongst the group. So a little backup. How do I meet Bob? Well, my life was kind of adrift when I was in college in the 70s. Didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew I didn't want to be a teacher because, as I said to my parents, I said, I spent up to this point in my young life trying to get out of the building. Why do I want to get a job that's going to put me back in the building? And then it happened. My mother had a flat tire in the town we grew up in, and she walked to the nearest person she knew to call someone to fix the tire while Dad was at work, and she walked in on Delph's mother, Jenny Sanborn. And while they were waiting for the tire to get changed, the conversation was, what are your boys doing, and this and that, and my mother does I think Chris should be a teacher, but he doesn't want to be a teacher. She said, well, my brother-in-law in Vermont works in schools, and he takes kids outside. That weekend I was driving to Vermont in the old Ford Falcon. And that's how I met Bob on a Friday night. Quick bullet Bob. Wow, hey, welcome. Yeah, good. Here's what we do. We take kids outside. We go canoeing. Come on down to the basement. I'll show you the game. Here's some Wanigans. Here's that. It was like mile a minute. And then, okay, you got sleeping bags? Yep, you can sleep in the den on the floor over there. See you in the morning. That's how it started. Now, I happened to have a couple, my brother was with me, my twin brother, and we had a couple bicycles on the roof rack. And so, of course, we were going to make a weekend of it, so where are we going? Well, we decided we're going to bike to Stowe. Bob took the car and drove it up there for us and figured out how to do the shuttle. You know, adventures, there's always a shuttle involved. So, anyhow, but he said, look, I couldn't hire you to be in this program I'm working on because you don't have a teaching degree. I was a sophomore. I was about to be a junior. He said, go get a teaching degree. Just then I transferred out to Montana that next fall, changed over to teaching. Came out of it with an earth science and social studies certification. And I wrote him in January and said, hey, I'm going to be having this program done, and maybe what's going on? Because he said he had been working on the idea of developing this combination of outdoor and environmental and this and that, which he'd done a lot right here in Rochester. But at that point in his career, he was down at White River, Hartford and all. And so he wrote back. It was encouraging. It was exciting. In those days, you just wrote letters back and forth, and you waited, And a couple back and forth, and then the spring went by, and nothing. Nothing. Well, at that point, I thought, well, I just guess I'm going to buy a bicycle and see if I can bike cross country. I don't think I'm going to have a job. Well, I hitchhiked down to Salt Lake to visit my brother, who was down there and going to school. And the phone rang, and that's Salt Lake apartment. Roommate says, Chris, it's for you. Hi, this is Bob. He tracked me down through our parents, I guess. Said, hey, that job I told you about? I think we're getting to get the money for it. It's going to come together. If you want it, call me tomorrow. Suddenly, my life is on screech. I got to do an about face, and it come. Anyhow, I said yes. And I showed up in August, and that's how it all started. And of course, right away, we got the canoeing program. We got kids outdoors, this and that. First week I was there. You ever drive a school bus? No. I had a license, but I've been pretty much running a bicycle around college campus for a few years. Hadn't really done that much driving. Maybe at the bus barn, 4 o'clock. I get down there. He was there ahead of me. He was sitting in the passenger's right-hand seat. I got on the bus. He goes, sit down. You're driving. Just like that. And I drove the bus out of there. That's how it started. He got me trained. I got licensed. That became the best teaching tool I had because Bob saw the environmental education, is not just a nature study program. He saw it as the community. And that was what he developed right here in Rochester when he was trying to keep the old school coming, staying. The way he explained it to me was that they wanted to make a union district. And he said, we got good stuff right here. And, it was like, yeah, we'll take the kids skiing at Killington and we'll do snowshoes and we'll paddle the rivers. And he took that experience down to Hartford. So anyway, so I used that school bus. And we'd take kids to courthouse, town hall, rock quarry, gravel pit, the dump, recycle center, so on. And of course the river and for hikes and this and that. And it was a tremendous tool. I worked with Bob 1 year. I mean, it seemed so much bigger than that. It was only 1 year. And then he went off to Montana on a sabbatical. Took the younger half of the family with him in a Ford Pinto wagon, I think, with a boat trailer and a 12-foot aluminum skiff loaded to the hilt with a tarp over it. And that's how they spent a year in Montana. That skiff is dear to my heart because years later it came to Buxton, Maine. And I've had a rope on it behind a sailboat all the way to Canada and back. Anyway, so I was on my own. I was staggering under the pressure of being a young guy trying to fill these enormous shoes that had been Bob Leister. And, but we carried on. And I was there 3 more years, total 4. And then there was a gal that came into my life, and you know how that story goes. So I ended up in Buxton, Maine, where she's from. And a fellow named Warren Foster took over after me and carried that program on. And I tell you this, and that went on for years. I tell you this because it's a credit to Bob that that town saw fit to keep that program going all those years. And a number of times, even when I was there and after, I heard there were budget cuts and they're going to whack the program. And then the town would rally and say, this is important. He didn't rely on some grant from Montpelier. It was funded locally. That was That was important. The other thing I've heard over the years is that town of Hartford is one of the best recycling centers and programs around. And Bob told me, he says, it's the kids that went through that program that grew up and voted it in. They got the lesson, right? Anyhow, those are good things. I'm trying to remember all the things I wrote. So I went to Maine. I did teaching for a couple years. And then I had a chance to get my hands dirty in the recycling industry, because I decided here's a chance to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. And that led to, one job led to another, and I've had a whole career in various kinds of recycling, and for many years now I've worked for, I worked for an outfit that was bought by Casella over there in Rutland that sells organic materials, mulches, compost, soil, and so on. Anyway, that's important in a minute. So Bob said one time when he came to visit in Maine, before I die, I want to have a boat that I can stand up in. And that sounded familiar because my dad had a sailboat when I was a kid, when I was young, and one of the phrases we heard many times was, oh, look, that boat has standing headroom. You know, our boat had a centerboard and a little cabin, you know, you did this, see? And so I knew what Bob was looking for. Well, he'd bring Scott down, who is kind of the end of the line, and, you know, on a Friday night stay with us, and then head off on Saturday with great hope in their hearts and eyes, looking for the boat of their dreams. And then they'd come back discouraged on Saturday night. This happened 4 times over 6 months. No success. We began to figure out that the boat of his dreams is this big, but his budget was this big. See? So back to this recycling career. I'm up working for the town of Brunswick at that point, 1981, and my mother liked the title Director of Recycling. It was a euphemism for head trash man, because we picked up recycling on Fridays and we did trash 4 days a week. But what it meant was I got to know every road in town. And I'm looking, all kinds of good stuff out there, including this good-looking sailboat. One of the things Dad had taught me was that boat has good lines. And this boat, I saw the guy's driveway, had good lines. But what really caught my attention was a huge hole in it. So, hey, Bob, I think I found a boat you can afford. Needs work. So the short version is, I found it, he fixed it, they sailed on Lake Champlain, I'd come up every year, sail with him. He loaned it to me for 3 years, then it came back to Vermont, and years later, he gave me the boat. I thought, you know, I'll say whatever he says, I'm gonna say, yeah, whatever the price is, yes. And he says, tell you what, I want the boat used, I'm gonna write you a bill of sale, give me $1. Take people sailing. So I take that to heart. My wife hasn't been on the boat for years because of age and issues. I still take people sailing. You're all invited. Look me up afterwards. Bob would be pleased. And I'm just going to close with the thing I did, write down one paragraph, and then I'll be done. Okay? and that takes me back to Bob, startled, looking at me, said few words. And I said, I was just in Randolph visiting Lucille. She really likes that place. And she played a big game of Scrabble last night with Midge, who was her former neighbor, you know, in Bethel. He looked at me, his big, broad smile came across his face. He lay his head down on the pillow. That's the last thing he said to me. I mean, but what I like to believe is that, you know, he spent his energies in his aging years keeping him and Lucille in the ranch as long as they possibly could. He was there till just about 2 weeks before the end. And so I believe that he laid his head down on the pillow with that smile, saying to me, mission accomplished.
Well, first of all, I was going to tell you that I'm not a Roman orator. And I think I've been listening to some people out here who are. What I'm going to say, I had to write down because my memory isn't worth a darn anymore. But let me tell you that maybe all the words that I've tried to write out have been put together just by the fact that one time when I went to Bob's, his wife and I were put up to bed, and I reached over to turn off the light upstairs, and here was exactly the same book, Cache Lake Country, that I spent my book reading when I was a little kid. What I have to say also, I wrote down in my best cacography so that I wouldn't forget to say a lot. I'm not going to say a lot, but I bet Bob, when he and I were both in first grade, in the 7th grade as kids, at Cranbrook School, about 20 miles north of Detroit in Michigan. And by the way, I promise not to tell anybody in Pennsylvania about Vermont, I promise. A school that we both loved, where the students loved Bob, and where the faculty, now let me read this and I'll do it quickly. The faculty gave Bob the award for citizenship, the highest honor in the school when he graduated in the 12th grade. It had only been given before to 2 people because Bob got it with Johnny Rice. They had only given that before in 1942 and in 1953. The school loved him. I know you all think a prep school is a prep school, you know, but Cranbrook was a very special place, and it was a big part of his life for at least 6 or 7 years. Just one more point. In the 4th grade, in the 12th grade, I'm sorry, the course in U.S. history was the toughest course in the school. Everybody dreaded it. In the final exam, there were 144 essay questions that they urged the students to get to know. So his advisor, Bob's advisor, said, "We think you should take this in the 11th grade." And he could see, he did that very diplomatically, but he knew the guy was thinking, that guy thinks I'm going to flunk. So in the 11th grade, he took this course, and he came home with a perfect A. That was part of his love of history. I also think that all the words that I've tried to write don't come together in any way the way Bob Leister as a person was. Let me take something from him instead of from my writing. Here's what he said about Cranbrook and about his life, things that he valued. "Cranbrook came unto me. My field was secondary education. So after the Air Force, I worked as a math teacher, coach, principal, superintendent, and 3 days a week now, I'm again a math teacher." I want to stop there just for a second. I followed him through school one day because the guy was really an admirable person, as all of you know. As we approached the door of one of his courses in higher math, the kids were raising the dickens. And Bob, who had been in the Navy, simply stood at the door and said, "Now hear this." So they spoke, and they loved that guy, and that's what they did. He said, "I guess I liked school, and I wanted to stay. At our school, I gathered a lot of teacher strategy from excellent teachers and a few poor ones." He wrote an essay to other teachers on ways to talk with the kids as they handed out the grades, good or bad, just to let the kids know that he knows who they were, that their parents were given the same essay. They're just not getting an A or a B or whatever. He wanted them to know him, and they did. My love for U.S. history, which I just touched on, began in the 4th form, which is up 8th grade, and burned in deep for the 5th grade, 12th grade. 144 essays, still surface in my mind. Trace the attempt at union in the American colonies from the first habitation unto the colonies, where it had to be united in his history. I'm going to be very brief because I'm not very articulate, but there is nobody in my life that I've treasured Bob more. I just got a note. Cranbrook was a beautiful school, academically and architecturally. The campus was 140 acres. There was a girls' school, a boys' school, a science center, an art academy, a beautiful church, and some of the architecture that we had was aimed at kids. This you can't see, but it's the gateway to friendship. Bob just sent me recently a letter, and in the letter, it said, in the card, by the way, was sent to raise some money, but the picture was beautiful. The gateway to friendship. Bob said, "Dear Jack, no one on earth I know more for into this card of the arches. It joins us here forever." I think I'll never forget Bob Leister. I've done a very bad job of conveying my impressions of him, but there has been nobody in my life by him. When we brought our kids out to visit Bob and Lucille, they didn't want to go home. And the next year, they said, "Are we going back now?" And I'd say, "Look, everybody's busy and this, that, and the other thing." "I don't care. I don't care," they'd say. "We want to go back and see Bob Leister." So I repeat that I will not tell anybody in Vermont about Pennsylvania. I will tell them a lot about Cranbrook and Bob Leister. Thank you very, very much for having me give you a short, awful bad talk. Where is my daughter? Here she is. This, believe it or not, is my daughter. Uh-oh, I dropped something.
It's all good. We're going to leave
Okay.
that there. Let's go all the way over.
Okay. Okay. You know, she's not very helpful.
Hello, everyone. I'm Hayden Thompson, and I was a student of Bob's and eventually a co-teacher during his retirement tour at the Sharon Academy. In no time at all, Bob was a good friend and mentor, and he and Lucille treated me like family. There's no way to succinctly put into words how much Bob has meant to so many of us. Perhaps the best way to describe it would be to share some anecdotes of Bob in action. Imagine Bob, who's 74 at the time and done counting, mounting the classroom table and crawling towards me. "You divided by 0? I cowered into my chair as Bob crawled on until I could smell the strawberry Danish on his breath. He repeated it over and over, and you can be sure that never again did I make the mistake of dividing by 0. This assertive approach was not just present in math class. Former students know that Bob really, truly wanted to know how you were doing. He would grab your hand and he'd lean forward as if to poke through this invisible bubble around us. And he'd drill you face to face, never releasing that hand. "What's the report?" He'd say it in an oddly accusatory way. Bob had peculiar organizational strategies. His briefcase was a 5-gallon joint compound pail. And after a few minutes of paper chaos, he would come out with the test of the day held high in the air. He had some funny sayings. He called giving a test throwing us in the tank with the piranhas. And he would, as we would bend our heads low, he'd sit, and begin, this is what he called pulling the teeth out of this one. Once in a while, he'd give us an easy test, and he would proclaim, "This one's like shooting fish in a barrel." Bob didn't just teach math. He also taught me the J-stroke during a 3-day canoe trip in the Adirondack Mountains. He taught me to bake a pineapple upside-down cake over a campfire using a reflector oven. And he taught me that salad doesn't necessarily have to be just green lettuce. In fact, it can have no lettuce at all and be predominantly cottage cheese. Not my favorite. Bob had so many stories. Once he told us of the time he had to climb on the backside of a ladder while hanging over the Atlantic Ocean on a Navy battleship. This was his backwards upside down way. This backwards upside down way of climbing a ladder was his way of explaining negative slope. Bob wrote lots of letters. He once wrote, "I feel the mission of teaching beats any other work area you can name." I am guessing that Bob's love for education and working with the next generation and the next generation was a great motivator to many in this room. He was a major factor in me getting into teaching. Bob's letters almost always include a photograph. I did the math, and 41% of the pictures on my fridge were either with Bob or taken by Bob. He was so good about taking photographs and sharing them the old-fashioned way. At any event, he would round up the troops and get the shot of the people responsible for the action that he'd come to see. We will all miss his Christmas updates with all the pictures of his much-loved family. What a force Bob Leister was, a force in every community that he touched, a force in each of our lives, and I will miss him terribly. Thanks.
Good morning. I'd like to start by thanking each of you for coming here today to honor my father. You all knew him as a teacher, as a colleague, as a mentor, or a friend. I just knew him as Dad. Dad was not a real Vermonter, by Vermonter standards. He always wanted to be. He was born in Connecticut and had been reared in Detroit. His father was an engineer. After graduating school, he attended Cornell University in their engineering program. He soon realized engineering was not his passion and transferred to UVM as a history major. It was at UVM he met the love of his life, Lucille Bramer, and they were wed the day after graduation, 66 years ago. He called Vermont his home, with brief exception the rest of his life. We moved to Rochester in 1959, a residence in front of the elementary school right on Main Street. Mom, Dad, and the 3 older kids. Scott came along later. Dad was perceived by the locals as a young upstart Flatlander who was now the principal of the high school. He had always had a garden since he was a boy in Connecticut and Michigan. Growing vegetables during World War II was a great way to augment limited resources back home. His first summer in Rochester, his garden was between our house and Cleo Johnson's, right on Lower Main Street, for everyone in town to inspect. Most gardens struggled that year, but Dad had so many tomatoes he was giving them away to the neighbors. A few eyebrows went up. Locals started believing this Flatlander may know a thing or two. Soon after assuming his post at Rochester High School, the town learned of another of Dad's skills. I'm sure no one knew he had been a track star in high school. He was not a bad sprinter, and he ran the hurdles, too. On this particular day, he received a call from an opposing school saying that the field was too wet to play the afternoon match. He watched the team bus disappear from the schoolyard during the conversation and jumped into action. He sprinted out of the office, unknowingly bowling over the superintendent who was coming in the front door, down the school steps, down School Street, and caught the bus as it made the corner by the hardware store, preventing that useless trip to the opposing town. Several of the kids were impressed with his speed. When Dad arrived at school the next morning, there was a bit of a crowd outside the main building, and he wondered what was going on. Across the second riser from the top of the front steps read, "Bullet Bob," in bold black spray paint. Dad had finally arrived. He had a nickname. Everybody in town who was anybody had a nickname. Canoeing was his getaway. He loved loading up the boats, heading out for days or weeks, camping in remote locations and having an adventure. Show up hands, how many people went on a canoe trip with Dad? The lessons kids learned while cooking on an open fire and what it took to get your gear from one lake to the next via a portage trail were all parts of the adventure. Without exception, every kid learned something about themselves on those trips. Teaching kids to paddle a canoe was incorporated into his new phys ed program. He called it Outdoor Phys Ed. Instead of a single class period several times per week to comply with state standards, he designed a plan where the whole school would shut down on Wednesday afternoons. Everyone went outside to participate in an activity. He got the faculty to buy in and lead these activities. Hiking, biking, canoeing, and field sports spring and fall. Downhill skiing at Killington, ice skating, and snowshoeing in the winter. His vision to expose kids to activities they could continue all their lives and enlighten them to the opportunities in their own backyard was revolutionary. He was way ahead of his time in other things, too. He drove small cars before the gas prices went up. He was very proud of his Ford Pinto as his commuter. He was also doing solar power experiments with his classes in the late 60s and early 70s. In the summer of '74, I helped him build what he hoped would be a solar heated house in Bethel. While the solar radiation never really worked out, the property became known as the Meadow, or more affectionately, the Ranch, and was a perfect piece of land for Dad. He had struggled for years gardening the rocky, heavy clay of West Rochester and found 11 acres of flat loam 18 inches deep without a stone to be found. He was in garden heaven. He tilled a piece about 50 by 150 feet and mowed in about an acre and a half around the new house. It was an impressive spread. He loved sitting on the patio on the east porch purveying his spread. I can't tell you how many family dinners, morning cups of coffee, or afternoon drinks we had on that patio over the next 45 years. It was one of his favorite spots. While enjoying a gin and tonic with him one early summer afternoon, I commented to him on the unusual configuration of the rows in the garden that year. He had apparently experienced heavy woodchuck damage the previous year and had difficulty drawing a bead on them with his trusty rifle. He had planted the rows radially out from the edge of the patio and explained to me that they wouldn't be able to hide between the rows when the plants got taller. He got 4 that season, and the problem went away for a couple of years. He did finally get solar panels on the house about 16 months ago, and he loved tracking their output, and we loved that he finally got his dream of a solar-powered house. At the beginning of my eulogy, I mentioned Dad's teaching degree was in history. He taught math and science throughout his entire classroom career, but he loved history. Military history was one of his particular interests. Going sailing on Lake Champlain, including a history lesson to whatever part of the lake you were in. Benedict Arnold fought off the French over here, Well, the British hid their ships in this cove over here, preparing to attack Fort Ticonderoga. He knew all the good stuff. Of particular interest to Dad was the Battle of Gettysburg. He read many accounts of the skirmishes that were part of that battle. He loved to take people there, walk them around the grounds, and give them a history lesson. Dave Raymond was unable to be here today, but he had the foresight to video one of these presentations by Dad at Gettysburg. The link to this video will be available over at Pierce Hall. I found it fascinating to watch and a wonderful memory of Dad teaching one of his favorite topics. When I asked friends and family what they remembered most about my dad, the warmth of the responses was overwhelming. Very generous, always there for you, stern when you needed, but never in a mean way, open-minded to new ideas, a good listener, incredibly enthusiastic, positive, other-centered, always enjoyed a good joke. I remember him as a genuine person, someone I could always look up to and be inspired by. He knew when to let you figure it out and when to give you guidance. He was kind and valued family over everything. He was intensely proud of his children's and his grandchildren's accomplishments. He never stopped teaching and never stopped taking care of family. My son Zeb, who's currently deployed with the Navy and unable to come home, he wrote to us last night, "A flag given to me by my grandfather was flown in memory of him on the 75th anniversary of Pearl Harbor over the USS Detroit, LCS-7, the ship he's serving on." A picture of a sailor walking away on a flight line you will see over in Pierce Hall is Zeb, leaving on that deployment. Dad was keeping it on his mantelpiece until he got home. I'd like to close by reading a letter that he wrote the family we found when cleaning out the top drawer of his desk right after his death. Dear Lucille, Scott, Mary, Chris, and Harry, this letter is much shorter than it should be. I am hopeful you will never read it. You five are the joy of my life. As a youth, I envisioned a vigorous family in which there was copious amounts of love, energy, action, skills, fun, laughter, and purpose. You all are examples of that personality type. It was my intent to write each of you a letter in some detail on how you made me the father who was most happy with his family. That I do not get a chance to write that letter hurts a lot. There is nothing negative now, just celebration of life. You filled me with love, with all of my love, Dad. Thank you all for coming.
Good morning. Thank you so much for coming from near and far. I don't know if I can come after that one. Bob Leister, Dad, Opa, accomplished many things in his life. He was a master educator, known far and wide for his innovative educational methods and passion for teaching young minds. The letters at the end of your program exemplify thoughts from his students and co-teachers. I personally loved the Wednesday afternoon phys ed. When I try to explain to people who don't live here that my high school phys ed was to rent new ski equipment, receive lessons from the ski pros, and ski all afternoon at Killington Ski Area, free of charge. They look at me like I'm crazy. This was a perfect example of the innovative style of Mr. Leister. He was a canoeist, a trip organizer, camper extraordinaire. He once wrote a handbook for trip organizers, sharing tips from his expertise. He was an environmentalist. Like the entire state of Vermont, it seems, he was green before it was cool. I'm the only Leister child who abandoned her home state and is living elsewhere, which I do catch grief for. I can tell you the rest of the country is just waking up to the need to be green. I learned at a tender age, when I left my bedroom light on, I came back to no light bulb. He was a patriot. Dad loved his country and was intensely proud of his friends and his family members that were active duty or veterans. I don't know anyone who was a bigger flag waver than my father. After all, he did have a full-size flagpole in the yard so he could run flags up and down it whenever he wanted. He was a sailor. Dad loved boats, specifically sailboats. When he couldn't afford to own what he wanted, he found a wrecked sailboat, which we've heard about, bought it cheap, and rebuilt it into the beautiful sailboat we know as Patchwork. Then he sailed it up and down the eastern seacoast and Lake Champlain. He also loved planes, specifically military planes, and would interrupt many a long trip with stops at remote airstrips along the way to look at and photograph old military planes. Don't you worry, Mom got him back by making him stop at all the quilt shops. He was a photographer. Dad took pictures of everything, and I do mean everything. Rarely did you see him without a camera hanging around his neck. I personally went through boxes and boxes and boxes of photographs, marveling at the breadth and depth of his photography. His woodworking was beautiful. If I asked for a show of hands, you might be surprised how many people own a piece of furniture in their home made by Bob Leister. He was a gardener. Again, who in this room has not received some vegetables from Bob Leister? I feel like sometimes he fed the whole valley. In his earlier years, he would routinely test Oma's cooking skills by showing up for dinner with 4 more mouths to feed after she had budgeted 1 pound of ground beef and 1 jar of ragu as dinner that night for our family of 6. Somehow, everyone left the table full. In his later years, Opa became the chief cook and bottle washer, as he would say. He would routinely and eagerly pick our brains on how to cook certain dishes that he liked. He was unquestionably the head of our family and the glue that kept us from drifting apart, as can sometimes happen to families as they age. In my opinion, his commitment to starting and continuing our 4th of July celebration and campout each year was a big part of this. Anyone who's ever visited or participated in this extravaganza will attest that relationships were built and thrived on the meadow. I am happy to report that this tradition will continue, not only because of the 4 Leister siblings, but because the 8 Leister grandchildren are so passionate about it. How many families can say that they have a family reunion because their teens and 20-somethings insist on them? This was the effect that Opa had on his grandchildren. But Dad's accomplishments that I am most proud of was his open-mindedness to learn about Jesus. He used to say that the walls of the church shook if Dad walked in. But several years ago, he started a Bible study with Pastor Homan. Long story short, he accepted Jesus Christ into his life and was walking with the Lord when he died. If Opa could describe the beauty and wonder of heaven now that he's seen it, I'm sure he would warn us also about the eternal cost of not going to heaven. I'm sure if he were here, we would hear an Opa speech about opening our hearts to Jesus. Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Said another way, the only way to heaven is to know Jesus. Opa asked me to share this and his love of Jesus today, and I'm sure he would want us each to ponder that love in our hearts. I personally pray that each of you will. Thank you.
I never knew this, but I'm not surprised Bob's favorite hymn was Onward. So you might want to stretch and stand and let's sing it like we mean it.
With the cross of Jesus
invited to join our choir because that sounded really good. Though I have known Bob pretty well over the past almost 14 years, obviously I missed some pretty good stuff along the way for the first 76 years of his life. Unfortunately, I never knew the real Bullet Bob, just the legends that grew up after him. I never knew him when his family was quite sure that the church walls would surely shake if Bob were to enter here. By the time I arrived here in 2006, the church walls were only shaking a little. And I'm pretty sure Bob was not the cause. I first remember Bob as a trustee. I remember maybe 11 or 12 years ago, them preparing for the annual church meetings that are every year in January. And every year the church trembled a bit over the budget. The fact that the amount of money that we think we will need for the coming year is always higher than the amount that actually comes in, like many churches. But I remember Bob one year sort of invoking the manna principle. He was saying with some authority that, for 10 years, as long as I can remember, it looks like there's not enough. And somehow, some way, some committee spends less, something that comes in, somehow it ends up being okay. There was something in the way he said it. Bob was saying, be faithful, keep chugging, God will provide. I remember well, as a trustee of the church, Bob played a crucial role in the discussions about whether to rent our bell tower out to AT&T for their cellular transmission antenna. Because on the one hand, for a small church with annual budget worries, the rental income was very tempting for us. But on the other hand, was it good for the town? And Bob, the green guy, was it safe for the town? Do we trust AT&T? Do we trust government regulators? Not sure, not sure. Were we going to help our financial problem only to create a public relations problem? And all the trustees poured over lots of technical information for months, as I recall, but I vividly remember Bob at our church and community forum concerning that matter, sincerely expressing how seriously he took those health concerns. He agonized over it, but how he, with good conscience, could recommend that we actually do this. And I think he carried the day on that. Again, if church walls once shook with Bob's approach, what I saw was his integrity and his authority now holding things kind of steady here for us. He told me one day in those early years how something I had said had made a huge difference for him, and I can take no credit for it. I wish I could, because I was merely repeating what somebody else had said that had made a big impression on me. But someone wrote that there is real Christianity, and then there's churchianity that many churches practice. And what that means is churches can easily begin to just settle for maintaining the institution rather than pursuing the mission. And if there ever was a Bob Leister word, it's mission. Well, it wasn't long before Bob was attending Bible study on Tuesday mornings with his old friend and math colleague, Marianne Martin. And Jeff Steinkamp was also there with us, and I know Jakey was there. In fact, Bob turned 80 when he was learning the Bible for the first time. And of course, we talked about how Moses was also 80 when he had his burning bush experience along the way. And as we have talked about, Bob always loved history. And a lot of times in Bible study, biblical history spilled over into American history because you begin to see that we're all a part of God's very great story, and that's true whether you believe in the story or not. It still is true. Much to talk about when Bob was there, and it grew to be a rather big group. But I remember in one of those Bible studies, we were talking about the fact that we creatures who have been created cannot think our way to God because God's thoughts are so much higher than our thoughts. So what God does is reveal himself, sometimes in big, glorious ways, but more often in very small ways. And Bob shared about when he was driving home from his own father's funeral. It was the end of the day, and it was dark, and he was driving home from his father's funeral and wondering, is there really anything beyond this life? And Bob told us how in the Bible study he kind of threw it out there to the universe. And he kind of said, God, if you're there, if there's more, I really wouldn't mind a sign. And Bob said he's driving along, he's rounded a curve, and suddenly there's this big old moon, right, with this huge ring, bigger than he'd ever seen before in his life. Did anybody see the moon last night? Something like that. Well, that sign certainly got Bob's attention. Coincidence? Maybe. But I can tell you that practical, down-to-earth Bob was pretty convinced that his prayer had just been answered. Well, Bob had occasional moments of spiritual reflection like that, but for the most part, his mindset was pretty much boots on the ground, as you know. And I never got over being amazed at how Bob could turn a phrase. He didn't so much express himself with mere words, he somehow punched the air with verbs. And it surprised me every time, and I'm really kind of jealous about that, and I think that might be a sin. I have to look that one up. But when you were with Bob, because of his words, because of his actions, you knew that life mattered, and it was not to be wasted, it was not to be frittered away, and you knew how everyone had a lot more potential than they thought they had, including me. I know a few times Bob very gently tried to increase my effectiveness as a preacher by suggesting I might want to just keep it a little shorter. So I told him how George Burns had said the secret to a good sermon is you have a good beginning and you have a good ending and you have the two as close together. I think I finally told him once, Bob, someday, please, read the Sermon on the Mount, all 3 chapters, read it out loud, and then see what you might suggest to Jesus. But if I could have changed myself in that regard, I would have. But have you noticed, as I have, that changing how we basically are isn't so easy, is it? In fact, in those places where it is most necessary that we change, it is impossible to change ourselves. And the Apostle Paul, who wrote maybe a third of the New Testament, said, I can will what is right, but I can't do it. Wretched man that I am, who will save me from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. It's one of my favorites. If the Apostle Paul can write that, well, there's no question that our world could use a lot more Bob Leisters, challenging us to be our best selves, reminding us that a good life is not just going to magically fall out of the sky. We've got to do our part. We've got to commit to good stuff. We've got to fight the good fight. Or as the psalmist said, Lord, teach us to count our days that we may gain a wise heart. And we do need a wise heart because life is indeed a battle. And not so much an earthly battle. In the last year or two, I watched Bob being willing, with ever-increasing determination, to stay in the fight, to not give up, to be oh so careful and not to fall in this day, because one fall is going to change the whole picture real quick. And each and every day to not give in to the demands of increased needs, which daily he had to meet with decreased ability. The math at the end of life is pretty precise. It is fixed, and there are no fudge factors. And at some point, we all have to surrender to truth, to reality, and ultimately to God. If anyone could have beat the odds, it would have been Bob Leister. But we all need a Savior. If we want our wiser hearts, and if we want our well-lived lives, and if we want our deeper love to live on, or just go away, that doesn't make any sense. Bob knew he needed Jesus Christ. And on the day before his 90th birthday, I visited Bob at the Dartmouth Hospice Center. And he was still able to express himself for 10 or 15 seconds and then drift for a while and then come back. But as always, he appreciated ending our time with prayer. And I tried harder than ever to keep it short. And then I came back one last time on Monday. And I came into a room fairly filled with people there. But people were convinced Bob could not respond, but people were convinced for very good reasons that he could still hear. And on that day, Bob was no longer in command, and he had no choice but to receive. To receive. Must have drove him crazy. But each person came to him to speak quietly to him with love and with gratitude for his teaching, for his counsel, for his life lessons. And after a long, hard fight and a noble journey, Bob's earthly life ended. And I took it as very good news the next day when Harry informed me that his father had passed away peacefully that night. So I want to leave you with an image that I have in my mind. It's Bob in eternity, no longer counting the years, crawling up on the table with unexpected ease in front of us, getting close to our face, reminding us that life matters, so live it well, and please, for God's sake, don't spend it dividing by 0. Do not spend your life parsing and dividing by things that don't matter, by things that won't last, by the fantasies that we live by to make us feel better in the present. There is simply no meaningful answers in that. So I'm so thankful to Bob. What a privilege even to get his last 14 years. Let us be in a spirit of prayer. Lord God, we give you thanks and praise. We are humbled by Bob. We are humbled by life. We are humbled by love. He brought the best out in people, brought out things that mattered. And oh Lord, all of his gifts came from you. And you have created each one of us not to be the same as Bob, but to be exactly how we are, and to go out and make a difference. So we'll take some of that energy, that determination, that focus, some of that leaning in rather than leaning away. Oh Lord, spread that around. Spread it on thick, because our world so needs that right now. We give you thanks and praise in the name of Jesus. Amen. Amen. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance on you and give you peace, now and always. Amen.